The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today I have the absolute privilege of speaking with Dr. Jerry Rosenbaum, the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and former chair of the Massachusetts General Hospital Psychiatric Department, where he led one of the nation's largest and most influential psychiatric programs for 2 decades. Dr. Rosenbaum has authored more than 400 scientific papers, edited 20 books, and has been recognized with numerous awards, including the C. Charles Burlingame Award for Lifetime Achievement in Psychiatric Research and the Ellis Medal of Honor. His career spans pioneering longitudinal studies on anxiety and depression, major leadership roles across national mental health organizations, and groundbreaking work in neuroscience and psychopharmacology. He now directs the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics, where his research focuses on how psychedelics change the brain and what this could mean for future treatment of psychiatric disorders. I really enjoyed speaking with Dr. Rosenbaum, and I'm excited to share this episode with you. So let's dive straight in. Jerry, a big thank you for coming onto the program today. I'm excited to be having this conversation, as I know how well written you are and the research that you've done, the volume that you've produced yourself, and with your wider team is incredible, and your body of work over a lifetime is so impressive. So I'm very excited to be speaking with you today.
Thank you, Nesh. It's very generous. It's a pleasure to be with you, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on your location.
Now, psychedelics is a big topic, I think, these days, and in particular with some of the more, I suppose, natural human conditions, and I call them natural human conditions, being whether it's anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. These are, at least the way I view it, normal responses to very difficult situations. These are the emotional responses. I don't know enough about psychedelics. They're discussed so much. I have tried to understand the protocols, but we don't do it here in Australia. So would love to be able to discuss a little bit more about how this space has emerged, what are the current protocols, maybe more so in the States and in your experience and the research that you guys are doing. If we could focus on that today, that would be lovely.
Sure. I got into the area of psychedelics rather late in my career. As you said, you said you don't know a lot, but we need to know a lot more. Clearly, psychedelic molecules, psychedelic agents, plants have been around for millennia and have been in use with humans in various settings, from the sacred to the recreational during that time. I think there was an awareness in the modern era of psychedelics going back, maybe to the 40s, 50s, and beyond, where there was an interest that they may not just be a impressive experience that involves perceptual changes and insights and experiences that are outside of the usual human condition, that led many people to sort of seek that experience, feeling that it opened up both inner and external universes that they hadn't been able to access before. But the modern era of psychedelics, well, really, I suppose there are two modern eras. There was a time back in, 50, 60 years ago when there was great interest in in psychedelics in psychiatry to service therapeutics, around alcohol use conditions, around psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. There was a lot of exploration going on to try to use this state that psychedelics engendered to try to enhance therapeutic efforts. That was shut down in the U.S. and for largely political reasons, and the drugs were deemed to have no scientific or medicinal value and were put on what we call Schedule 1, which means they're illegal to access or use. And so the opportunity to explore their potential really was shut down for several decades. That didn't prevent a lot of, I guess you'd say, illicit, or sometimes we say underground use to occur in society, and really not just in the US, but obviously worldwide. So many molecules, so many different sources of a psychedelic experience that vary in different ways, from short to long to challenging to pleasant. So those, I guess, sometimes called recreational uses, but endured, although with potential criminal consequences, but largely, I think, ignored by police and others. And so if people wanted access to these substances, it was not that challenging if you had connections and resources. In that experience, which was probably millions of people, and there were some who didn't just describe a remarkable visual or perceptual experience, a journey, if you will, but some who found the experience to be helpful or transformative in some way. Even colleagues that I've spoken to have said they were at a time in life where they felt lost or depressed, and they had a psychedelic experience, and it sort of turned on a switch. They felt kind of like they were back to a restart, and they had the ability to experience themselves and others in a different way, to think about their lives in a way that turned out to be useful to them, kind of repurposed. But and those anecdotes, I mean, what do they say? The plural of anecdotes isn't data. So it didn't necessarily move the dial on scientific thinking, and even in neuroscience and psychiatric settings, through those decades from the 70s on, psychedelics were viewed with suspicion. They were called hallucinogens. There were certainly instances where the use of psychedelics was associated with bad outcomes, of people coming to emergency rooms after a bad experience, or associating their use with triggering of a psychotic episode or condition. So there was a lot of skepticism about their value and potential and safety. The turning point in the modern era, there was research programs that did find ways to access different forms of psychedelics, often mushrooms, and try to use them in therapeutic settings. One of the most intriguing and maybe influential were programs at Johns Hopkins and NYU that were looking at psychedelic experiences in people who were faced with challenging diagnosis, potentially end of life, and had associated anxiety and depression, which was diminished or relieved and in an enduring way after exposure to a psychedelic. So that was intriguing. But I think the turning point really goes back to the impressive journalistic effort in the form of the book that Michael Pollan published called Changing Your Mind, that sort of told the story of psychedelics throughout history and the modern era, the synthesis of psychedelic compounds in the 40s, and the efforts by different individuals and groups, from the Shulgins to the modern era of exploring use, Humphrey Osmond, others who had written about and talked about it. But Pollan put it all together in an impressive volume that included his own cautious experiment with these agents that I think put to rest a lot of the myths about their danger. For example, they're not addictive, about the quality of the experience, the data, observational data that was available, and kind of, I think, triggered a kind of a renaissance of interest in more broadly, where research groups, look for opportunities to study them more, where groups of advocates came together to try to decriminalize these drugs, to thinking that it's really not the role of the state to keep individuals from having this experience when it's arguably so much safer than so many products people have access to that are legitimate, like alcohol and tobacco, and in many areas, cannabis as well. As I said, psychedelics aren't addictive. The experience is brief. Many people feel positive experience from it. But the idea of pursuing it not just as a journey or an experience, or even a kind of a spiritual experience, but rather as something that could treat what we call psychiatric disorders, that's relatively more recent. And the trick in that effort is that you have to find ways to take these widely available substances that exist in nature and are easy to synthesize, and find ways to develop intellectual property around them, such that a company can invest the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that are necessary to bring them through the process of regulatory approval to make them a drug and to pick indications for them. So a few companies got started in that, and again, most of these companies simply took the extant psychedelics that you can find ways to access, and found ways to either synthesize or alter their molecular structure in a way to give them intellectual property that made them, something that they felt they could commercialize, the bell tolls, and that led to kind of a gold rush, if you will, and maybe hundreds of companies have sort of joined in the race to find a psychedelic molecule that they feel they can develop one way or another, and segment the universe of potential indications to identify something they're going to develop their molecule for, and research goes on to try to determine whether it's possible to refine through medicinal chemistry psychedelic molecules to have new properties, or to dial out the psychedelic experience to still have the therapeutic benefit. And what was observed is these molecules have a variety of effects. Most of them, if not all of them, work through the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, as well as interacting with other receptors in the brain that trigger a cascade of events and changes in brain connectivity, surge in neuroplasticity as new synapses are formed, and new neuronal connections are made, and so forth. I didn't just lose you, did I?
No.
And mechanisms of action were sought to understand how these changes might take place. So I mentioned neuroplasticity, the spiritual experience, maybe in some cases decreased inflammation, changes in the way regions of the brain connect with each other. There are some data in preclinical data that for rodents, these drugs may reopen critical periods for learning sort of fundamental structures for how we relate to others, social learning, and where in rodents that the opportunity to sort of to develop social learning is in a critical period that reopens. So there are all these mechanisms of action that may be underpinning, what we see. But the first evidence in sort of the traditional drug discovery process was that these look like rapid acting antidepressants, that you can give one treatment, one dose or two of a psychedelic, and somebody who's diagnosed with a depression, particularly a difficult to treat depression, so-called treatment resistant depression, can actually experience marked improvement, even remission in maybe a third of those patients. And that new state seems durable, and that, out 3 months, with sort of an average duration of staying well, and in some cases, observations that people remain well for up to a year. So that kind of fueled the gold rush to say that these are remarkable drugs. They have effects we don't completely understand, but they seem to change the state of the human brain and give it a chance to move from a distressed state to a non-distressed state, from depressed to non-depressed, from ruminative and stuck to non-ruminative, to anxious to non-anxious. So there's a lot of that activity going on. So I'm not. So that's interesting, and we'll see how that develops. How I got into it is a sort of a different story. I mean, I had been chair of the department here at Mass General for about 20 years. I've been at Mass General for 51 years. And around 2018, as I was approaching my use-by date, I was trying to figure out what I might do with the opportunity I had to sort of stay on, but not have to administer a large academic department. And I was focused on ways to treat people who were not getting better with traditional treatments, psychotherapies, drug therapies, device therapies. And at that moment, I was kind of focused on what seemed to be a universal source of distress. That was what we call transdiagnostic, that everybody who suffered from a psychiatric disorder as defined would say was a big part of what made them hurt. And that was the phenomenon of stuck thinking or rumination. It may vary in content by disorder, but it was typically, regret or past injury or some period of distress that one was stuck on and couldn't stop thinking about. And it was sort of like trying to solve it, trying to get out of it, but never being able to be free of it. And when people were in the heights of their psychiatric condition, whether it's substance use or anxiety or depression, rumination would be intense. When they were well, it might settle down to be more moderate. And before they got ill again, you could see it starting to rise. So it seemed to be, either an important foundational element to psychiatric disorders, or at least, a feature of them that counted for a lot of the suffering. So along with colleagues, we tried to figure out how we'd approach that problem, and did sort of simple academic things like develop a new scale for measuring rumination as a state rather than a trait, and began designing neuroimaging studies to look at brain connectivity and in severe depressed people who ruminate. But I had the opportunity by chance to hear from Robin Carhart-Harris, the name you might know, who's one of the pioneers in this area, some of his early neuroimaging data. And probably thinking over in an oversimplified way, I saw some of the brain changes he was describing, particularly in the default mode network. And since the default mode network is very active in people who ruminate and is important for how we self-observe, I thought that there may be something in how psychedelics disconnect that network that might have some role in treating people who ruminate. So my colleague Sharman Ghaznavi, who had previously studied rumination during her PhD as an MD PhD, and I decided we'd source psilocybin, and that connected us with company that was involved in developing psilocybin as a drug, and they provided us with psilocybin. But in that process, inspired us to think bigger than just doing a study, because the place where I work, Mass General, is not just a hospital; it's a nearly $2 billion a year research enterprise. And so we call it the Mass General Research Institute. And obviously, cancer and cardiology are important, but neuroscience is one of the jewels in the crown. And it's a place that basically invented fMRI and the connectome and major neuroimaging systems that we all use, and prides itself on being at the forefront of the basic science or the bench to bedside efforts in changing the face of medicine. So it was a setting with resources far beyond what any company could ever pull together. And so we started out just talking to colleagues whether understanding or working with psychedelics had any interest. And what was remarkable, I mean, it may have just been, luck, but the first few, really significant scientists, basic scientists I spoke with said that they've always had an interest, but never felt safe about articulating it in this serious academic environment. And by then I was, an elder in the institution, had chaired the executive committee on research, and they felt that if I could give them cover, they would reveal their interest and begin working together in this area. So we formed something called the Center.
That there's an underlying current of interest, wanting to explore it, but a hesitation still. There's like concern or worry.
There's some vigilance about the stigma. I'm often asked, how did you get an institution like Harvard and Mass General to approve something like that? And the answer was, you don't ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness. And we just declared ourselves the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. Now we actually have a space and some resources and so forth. But the president of the hospital, the CEO, was a terrific guy. One day, I told him that we were doing this, and he said, "Why?" And one of my mentors used to say, one of the great things about the Mass General is that no matter what you want to do, they may not help you, but they don't stop you. So as long as I wasn't asking for money, he was fine with it. And so the center became a reality. And in the beginning, I think the most important thing, because this was 2018, really 2019, was that we came into existence. And so many, I don't know, in the media and places, would make reference to this, even though we hadn't really done anything. But just that we'd come into existence sort of validated the area. And I actually expected that all these people with vast sums of money who were investing in all these companies would see the value of supporting a kind of basic, scientific, not-for-profit effort, but that really wasn't the case. Fortunately, there were some. So we raised some funds for our studies and had some contracts and got a lovely grant from a foundation to support years of young people's research in the area. So and then you never once you start something, you just never know all the things that might come to be that enhance your effort. If you never start it, you never find out. So among other things is that we found a 2,000 square foot medicinal plant lab that had been used by molecular biologists for many years, but had been left unoccupied for a decade or two when the scientist up there retired. And my colleague Steve Haggerty and his colleague Surya Race took possession of it as in the name of the Center of the Neuroscience of Psychedelics, and began curating plants from around the world using large language models and AI to explore, everything that's ever been written about non-scheduled plants that appear to have psychedelic-like properties, often different from the psychedelics we use now, like maybe causing auditory instead of visual hallucinations, things like that. And we were, a friend of mine was the chair of the molecular biology department, owned the space. He was glad to have somebody occupy it because they were just paying the indirect costs for it without having any use. So we acquired this space, which was, 3 large greenhouses, an office space and lab space. And now we're growing these plants, and creating little microenvironments, deserts, Amazon, whatever, to mimic the place. They're again growing these plants, and then Steve and his lab are extracting, fractionating, using mass spectrometry and iPSC derived mini brains to do high throughput screening of the molecules in these plants to identify what the active substances are and compare them to the current psychedelics we know. So that's become a major focus of the center here, which is exploration, and then because it would be almost impossible to sort of apply for a grant from traditional funding agencies for something that novel. The hospital and the center partnered with an Australian entrepreneur to start a company to raise funds to develop a psychedelic. We have a lead, but also to use funds to support the work in the greenhouse, with the understanding that company would have, although the intellectual property is owned by the institution, the company would have rights of first refusal for anything that came out. So that's become sort of a centerpiece of the center. But there are other things going on, clinical trials in novel indications like inflammatory bowel disease, or the study I mentioned is still going on rumination and treatment-resistant depression. We do an annual course that brings in 500 or so colleagues from around the world to teach about psychedelics. We train young people and residents. So a lot of things have come to pass, even though I didn't raise the vast sums that I hoped that would allow us to do whatever we wanted for as long as we wanted. We're still in the game and enjoying the explorations of novel therapeutics and novel uses of these substances. And we're watching as so many companies are sort of introducing their particular psychedelic, touting its particular advantages for their particular indication. And the field had a kind of transformative event where a former member of our faculty here who co-founded a company called Gilgamesh. One of his psychedelic molecules was pipeline was acquired for $1 billion plus from a major pharma. So suddenly that changed. It changed the world as people said, well, maybe there's something to this. So
what's been the indications from the clinical trials? I assume if pharma is acquiring those sorts of numbers, they see some real potential. There are some signals that are being seen that are quite promising. I'm assuming at those sort of estimates. What are some of the indicators that some of
the early focus was on depression, particularly what's called treatment-resistant depression.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was selected in part because at least for the first movers, they had to be addressing a problem that was an unmet need, and to sort of feel that they'd get a positive response from the FDA and the regulator. So they chose treatment-resistant depression because by definition, it's sort of an unmet need. But other companies have also are looking at treatment-resistant depression. Some are now taking on depression itself. PTSD has been in focus. There are companies that have looked at generalized anxiety disorder. Some looking at very other subtypes of depression, like postpartum depression. There's early interest in substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, even eating disorders. And people are exploring, the whole spectrum of psychiatric disorders, except being very cautious about psychotic disorders because of the reports of people who have either come into the emergency room with psychotic episodes adjacent to having used psychedelics. So although there's some interest, I think some very small, kind of more academically focused interest in whether these molecules, particularly if changed in a way so that the psychedelic experience is dialed out, might be relevant to psychosis or schizophrenia or bipolar. But there's much more caution about using psychedelics in those conditions at the moment.
And the indicators are generally positive in terms of, from the way you described it, looking at the rumination levels coming down.
Well, I don't know. Rumination. I mean, is often is for these studies, the industry focused studies would be focused on the diagnostic element on depression, and looking at things like rumination would be what secondary outcomes. But yeah, where looked at, the results are generally positive. If there's anything negative to say about the data, I mean, there are a couple of things. One is, in some cases, the efficacy wasn't as robust as expected or hoped, but still was as good or better than traditional treatments. And there's always the challenge in evaluating efficacy of psychedelics, in that they're really, at least the psychedelics that haven't tried to dial out the psychedelic experience, they're unmistakable, so they're hard to blind. And the gold standard for judging whether a treatment has efficacy is that people don't know what they're on, and you're comparing it to a control. And most people, I think almost all, will know whether or not they've gotten a psychedelic in a clinical trial, as opposed to the placebo or a very low dose of the psychedelic that's not expected to be effective. So it's the issue is called functional unblinding in what are hoped to be double-blind trials, and that remains a challenge for developing these drugs. But the extent of efficacy, and in particular the durability of the efficacy, has led many people to believe that we're really seeing something of great potential to help people with psychiatric disorders. Now, in the beginning, those who were advocating for psychedelics, even going back to the 70s, those early studies I talked about, they were used adjunctively in psychotherapy, so to create a state where people are more open to associations or memory, or able to tolerate memories of trauma, and to use the therapy before and after. And for some molecules that are not technically classic psychedelics like MDMA, perhaps even during the experience where they can tolerate memories. And so the field for a while was called psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. That sort of came to a crashing halt when a company called Lykos was trying to develop MDMA for MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. It had very impressive efficacy data, but had certain other challenges in their review. But in particular, the idea that the FDA was being asked to approve not a treatment, but a facilitator of psychotherapy, when the FDA itself is not, it does not evaluate efficacy of psychotherapy. That's not in their domain. And so they will not issue an opinion about psychotherapy. So it was hard to figure out how to evaluate this package, which was really saying the psychotherapy was the therapeutic element, and the drug was really just there to facilitate it. So that sort of led to kind of a pivot in the psychedelic world to just to develop the drugs as a treatment by themselves, and not say that they are associated with psychotherapy. That's not so crazy, because they can, to get approval, you just need to be better than your control. You don't have to show that you've delivered it in the most optimal manner. And that's not so different than the state of psychiatry today. If you had a population of people with, say, depression, and you could give them psychotherapy or a drug or the combinations, Some will get better on psychotherapy, some will get better on the drug. A lot more will get better on both. But to get approval as a drug, you just have to show that the drug has efficacy by itself. You don't have to show that you've delivered it in the most efficacious way. So that's sort of the strategy now. Just get the drug approved, and hopefully clinicians trying to do the best for patients will integrate not only the preparation and integration of the psychedelic experience, but a true psychotherapy before and after.
Because the way that I've, at least up until now, up until this conversation, seen this being used is the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So this is new to me in actual fact. And that's been a pivot because of what you described, looking at it as an adjunct, or it's actually the active therapy that's being provided. So it's kind of just being trialed now like it would be any other molecule where we're going, whether it's an SSRI. This happens to now be clinical trials. Obviously, there's a blinding, functional blinding difficulty, but it's just been trialed in the traditional sense.
Right. Yeah. And you know, my belief, and I'm sure it's shared by many others, is that following the psychedelic experience, there is a window of openness to learning and change that I think is enhanced, not just during the experience where you really can't do much with a classic psychedelic except support somebody to stay with the experience, but during that period afterwards, when presumably there's been a surge in structural neuroplasticity, you're more able to be resilient or to change. Although some people worry that in this a time of sort of enhanced change in learning, if you're confronted with adversity or back in a difficult situation, whether it's poverty, domestic abuse, what have you, that openness to change may actually bite you in the back. Although I don't think there's any evidence for that now, and it's just a theoretical concern that being open and having structural neuroplasticity that allows you to change. I've had some people speculate that the experience does bias you to positive change, but in theory, if you're open to new learning and change, that you might even imagine that there's some vulnerability in that state as well.
And is this at least the most or most commonly held understanding, is that with the introduction of these molecules, there is an openness, there's a surge of neuroplasticity. There is an idea that it's potentially a little bit more on the positive side, and that openness allows for, I suppose, new perspectives to be taken. Is that kind of just the general hope?
Yeah, I think
maybe it's a hope or at least observation.
I think it's the observation. I think it's it would describe consensus that it's consistent with the observation that people are suffering. They have this experience, and the majority of them suffer much less, or close to not at all, at least for a period of time. There's a question about how much time that right now. I mean, the speculation is that if you have a depression and you have a very positive experience and you meet criteria for a remission, that on average you'd expect that to last a few months, and that the experience may have to be repeated quarterly. For some people, there may be more durability, and there'd be fewer booster sessions, and for others, they may require more frequent maintenance. And we see that with other treatments that are used, like ketamine or ECT, even, that some people get a remission and stay well. Others require maintenance treatment at varying intervals.
And how is the intervention given? Is it provided and then the person's held in a safe space for a period of time? How does that work?
So ideally, people talk about set and setting. So you have to be well prepared to understand the experience you're about to undergo. And then ideally it's carried out in a non-clinical setting, in a setting that seems more welcoming, comfortable, more living room like, with a comfortable place to lie down, often with eye shades and with a set list of music, sometimes curated by the patient, sometimes recommended by the caregiver, and then a person or persons are available just to be a source of support, to encourage a person who's starting to feel uncomfortable to stay with it, or to look inward, and not much more than that is done. Whether that will be replicated if and when a psychedelic is approved and is being administered in clinical settings, remains to be seen. There's a lot of talk about the using the infrastructure that it's arisen, at least in the United States, to deliver ketamine treatment, which are these clinics that you can go and they get an infusion or intranasal ketamine, and then you're observed for a period of a few hours and then sent home. They're not set up that way that I described the setting for a psychedelic experience. So I'm not sure, once these treatments are approved, that they'll be optimized in terms of that kind of setting and attention to, support and that detail. But we'll see.
3 months of enduring relief of suffering sounds very impressive. If we're talking about something like treatment-resistant depression, like that is, where we start scratching our heads and going, what do we do? This is like the ECT sort of space. Well, what do we do? Throw something at it, because obviously we're trying to reduce the immense suffering. And at that point, someone's tried everything. They've gone through, seeing a psychologist, all the different psychiatric approaches. They've, done everything under the sun. And so something that has, the potential for 3 months of enduring. The word, I think, enduring is pretty impressive.
Well, we have to remain cautious about being too optimistic. People talk about the issue of hype with psychedelics. The clinical trial subjects are not necessarily representative or generalizable of the people that you see in clinic, and they're highly screened. Usually, you screen hundreds and hundreds of people for meeting the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the study, and you rule out being on other medicines. You rule out numbers of treatments they've had. You rule out some cases they're being on treatments, and their recent use of alcohol or cannabis, or on and on. And you end up finding that if you screen 100 subjects, you're probably 3, 4, or 5 might be eligible. And they don't have comorbidities, that are ruled out. Comorbidities is our way of saying that psychiatric populations are very heterogeneous, and they don't necessarily they haven't read DSM-5 and believe that these are discrete real disorders that are unique among us. And people have depression, they have anxiety, they have some most obsessive compulsive symptoms, they have some history of substance. They're more complicated than that, and or medical conditions, etc. So how much clinical trial experiences in clinical trial populations, whether it be adverse effects or efficacy, translate to the messier business of the people you see in your office, that remains to be seen.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because once you rule all of that out, it's clearly not a representative sample. And if we are trying to remove, basically all comorbidities and every other medication and so on and so forth,
one anecdote for our first neuroimaging study, because we had sourced the psychedelic from a company, and we were going to do the study under their IND. We had to follow their inclusion and exclusion criteria, even though it wasn't a treatment study. It was just to do neuroimaging. And we had a wait list as we were waiting for the drug to arrive that approached 700. And by the time we screened them, we had one or two. And so we basically had to go back and get our own IND and change the inclusion and exclusion criteria so we could enroll subjects.
There's a
So
bit of a quandary there in terms of it's not generalizable when there's such a high exclusion criteria, and at the same time, if you open it up, the argument again will be we can't generalize it.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, a lot of it was that and those, at that time, people didn't know how safe it was to give psychedelics to people who were on psychiatric drugs. So there are people who couldn't get off their psychiatric drug. And then there was use of cannabis in the last 6 months. Well, that's a huge, and then alcohol, and so that wiped out a lot of the potential. And as said, that those are rare people who haven't used cannabis, alcohol, or can stop their psychiatric medicine.
Why is alcohol excluded from a time period?
Well, that's a great question. In this case, it's because this was early years, and we were using a company's drug, and really outside of their control, and so the last thing they want would be some unexpected safety issue. So it was really trying to get the cleanest the population that wouldn't have confounding elements of intoxication or withdrawal or what have you.
Would a 2025 or a 2026 study potentially look different now in terms of those risk factors have been better understood and the threshold is going up in terms of what that willingness is?
Yeah, there's some studies now that allow people to stay on their antidepressants as long as they don't change them and they're still suffering. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
what are your personal views about what you think this research will uncover? Is it and obviously we're just kind of guessing here, but you've got a lot of experience in overseeing this, reading the research, knowing the peers who are doing it. What do you see potentially comes from this, if you hazard a guess? I know it's not scientific, but we're trying to pull from patterns.
They say this isn't the beginning or the end; it's the end of the beginning. What we've realized, which is, I think, transformational, is that it's possible to accomplish a profound change rapidly when we've always thought these things took weeks to work. That the brain is capable, and as we come to understand it better, particularly how this happens, that we have the potential for new generations of rapid acting treatments that will reduce these long stays in hospital and these weeks of suffering while waiting just to see whether your treatment's going to work. I mean, in a way, even if your treatment doesn't work, to learn that in a day instead of 8 to 12 weeks is a great advance. So I think the awareness that a new generation of what we'd sometimes just call rapids is imminent, if not here, and then we can improve on those. That we might be able to improve on them so that you don't have to have a procedure where you have to spend several hours in a doctor's office with all the associated infrastructure costs of personnel and space that will inevitably limit access. It'll be a great treatment that only a handful of people can find, or insurance companies will pay for. That we're likely, within the next several years, identify treatments that are less disruptive, can be taken orally, likely can be used at home, but still be used intermittently, like once a week or something like that. Now that we see that we can accomplish it, like everything else, we just have to now figure out how to make it more efficient and scalable, and so that's I think the promise of the psychedelics bring us. They can't be the only way. They've just shown us that there is a way.
Mm. There's enough anecdotal stories out there that have shown profound changes
Yeah,
for
and even in
people.
clinical trials. I mean, people who haven't been well in many months or up to 2 years, I think is, for most of these studies, who experience a remission that lasts weeks. That's a big deal. And so the psychedelics themselves, not to get, too far ahead and think about, what the future will be like, but they in the next 2 to 5 years, they will be, in the pharmacopoeia, and they will be useful tools. Um, there will be challenges in terms of affordability and access, but again, this is just the first generation. This is and we'll get more precise and more efficient as we explore this space more and try to understand the full cascade of brain changes that these drugs influence, and then to identify those that are critical for changes in suffering.
How much of this is tied up in regulations of trying to? It seems to me like this is fairly safe. That the question mark of safety is not as high as it initially was, and obviously it's very wise to be very cautious at the beginning. It sounds like if there is potential for this to open up in 3 to 5, even if we say 10 years, that safety concerns have been predominantly addressed. Is that reasonable to say?
I mean, there are some who would say that we don't fully know all the long-term risks, but that's always true of any
Of anything? Yes.
new treatment. But from what we can observe, not that they're risk-free. I mean, there are individuals, and we remember from the 70s, particularly with LSD, who used an awful lot of of LSD during that time of tune in, turn on, drop out. Who suffered visual or other neurologic changes that were enduring the hallucinogen post-perceptual disorder syndrome, or flashbacks and trails and stuff like that. There were some concerns theoretically about one of the receptors that some of the psychedelics bind to, the 5-HT2B, but that was seen with daily chronic use of drugs that impacted that receptor, was associated with valvular changes in the heart. Seems unlikely with the very intermittent dosing of the psychedelics. They're not addictive. So yeah, the safety fears, I think, have been amplified by those who were influenced by the labeling of the drugs as dangerous in Schedule 1, which we saw historically with cannabis as well. That you go back to the 30s and look at how regulators viewed cannabis. I mean, there may be still people in prison for life for possessing marijuana in some states in the United States. So there's been a shift as we recognize that nature provided a lot of these substances, and humans have interacted with them for millennia, and you need to be mindful of certain risks, and they can be upsetting or challenging experiences. But even then, people who have had them said that the long-term outcome was more positive. So the regulatory burden has been difficult for treatment development. They still are listed as Schedule 1 in the United States. You have to go through all kinds of regulatory hoops to gain access to. I mean, for our study with neuroimaging, we have to have policemen escort the pill from our pharmacy downtown to the imaging center, nearby, because of the Drug Enforcement Agency. I mean, it's absurd. And it took us 2 years to get our first study up and running because of all the hoops we had to jump through. So, in a way, it's sad because it has delayed um, access to treatments that could have helped a lot of people.
That's I suppose the great challenge with it being Schedule 1, and that you mentioned it was shut down initially for political reasons, and so now trying to turn that ship around is difficult, and the costs associated with even having police to go out and escort, means that research becomes less and less viable because the costs just ramp up.
Sure. I mean, back in the day when even America's leaders knew that they couldn't challenge the right to free speech. They understood that the way to attack the free speech they didn't like was to attack their drugs of the people who were saying things they didn't like. So that, as my understanding is, that was a big part of why the White House was adamant about making these substances illegal.
Just to
so
be
they could
fair and
criminalize the users.
Yeah. Just to be fair and balance the conversation, what have been the, I suppose, adverse reactions, responses that the clinical trials have recorded? Because obviously that's a big part of going out and getting approval. What's shown up?
Well, the biggest concern have been signals of on some of the subjects in the studies who weren't suicidal before but were suicidal after the experience. Very, very, very small number, but not zero. And the understanding of it. I mean, one of the explanations that I hear is that these were individuals who did not respond. They were treatment-resistant individuals with high hopes of benefit, and so the idea that you think of this as your last best hope, and it didn't work, may influence that. On the other hand, there's certainly been a trailing story of whether there's a very small group of people exposed to serotonergic agents historically that report an increase in suicidal ideation upon administering of these drugs. It's noted in the drugs label, and it's pretty rare. But clinicians are advised that when you start an SSRI, you be alert for that emerging. That I think there's no association with suicide, but with suicidal ideation. So whether that's a pharmacologic effect or a psychological effect related to the failure to respond is unclear. I've heard anecdotes. Among the sources of greatest encouragement for the development of psychedelics has been the experience of military veterans who have returned from battle, pretty wounded and by the invisible wounds, with substance use, depression, PTSD, and so forth. And while having had access to treatment, have failed one treatment after another. And particularly with the special operators, like the Navy SEALs or Green Beret type, there have been programs that have delivered hundreds of them to be able to access a psychedelic and ibogaine and DMT in out of country, and many of them come back and have told remarkable stories of recovery. Returning to their family life, to themselves after being in a very dark place. What I've also heard on the side is that not everybody has responded, and those who didn't. Some of the agencies who connect with these individuals have worried about bad outcomes. And again, I don't know specific data, but we were reached out to sort of put together a video to remind people that while these are powerful treatments, and it's likely that if a treatment is powerful, there can be some bad effects, and we need to learn more. But it's likely that these were people who just didn't benefit from an experience that many of their colleagues or brothers and sisters in arms had described as transformational, and the aloneness and demoralization that might engender would be worrisome. Even though there may be other treatments, many other treatments they haven't tried and failed. So that's a possible explanation for this.
Yeah.
There may be a biological explanation. There's understanding that the serotonin system is involved in some complex way with suicidal ideation. But again, these were very small numbers, and not all studies have seen this side effect. Other side effects, are that you might worry about if you're, have compromised cardiovascular system, and you get an increase in blood pressure or pulse or something that, might be risky for some. Again, there's the potential of challenging experiences, the potential of this window of vulnerability to change, and what world you go back into there. Otherwise it's headache, dizziness, maybe some anxiety, but transient, relatively benign, but potentially unpleasant side effects.
Yeah. Look, I've always, just from a clinical, as a clinician, I've always thought clinically the hopelessness that comes from the high expectation of, for example, administering an antidepressant has to account for a level of percentage. And it seems to me like it would be a reasonable percentage if I have to just hazard a guess. Obviously, I haven't researched it, but if I were the client going, I've put a lot of stock in this, I think it's going to work for me, and then it doesn't, that would be incredibly demoralizing.
I always start out, if it's a patient who is starting out seeking treatment, I try to let them know it's a journey.
Yeah.
And that, some people actually find a destination early and they're fortunate. But the array of possible therapeutic interventions, just even pharmacology alone, let alone therapies and devices and so forth. Yeah, the potential number of combinations and augmentations. The problem is that most people don't get them. They're given an antidepressant and say, well, we tried. But, I can go down a path of, 50 or 75 different things just pharmacologically.
Yes.
And while each step along the way, whether it's, optimizing, combining, augmenting, switching, novel things, it may be that your likelihood of success diminishes with each failure. Still, I've seen people out 10 or 12 steps, where you finally hit on something that's for them is magical. So I try to keep hope alive and lower expectations that the first or second or even third thing we try is going to be magical, although we're going to obviously hope for that.
Yeah. Jerry, where can people find out more? The listeners who are interested, how can they find out more about, the research that's going on? Obviously, there's people tuning in from all around the world, but the target here is Australia and maybe parts of the US. Where can people find out more?
Well, I use ChatGPT. They're quite, if you ask them what you want, whether you want, the names of the companies and what drugs they're developing, or what's in phase 1, phase 2, what treatments are likely to be on the market in phase 3, what's the evidence for, what's the potential mechanism of action. It just lays it out for you. I mean, you can go to websites like our website and learn about what we're doing, but we don't keep it up nearly as well as using AI. But I just keep asking all your questions. Like if the questions you're asking me, if you ask ChatGPT, you get pretty good answers. About even about plants, I imagine. But about mechanism of action. What are the theories? What are the risks? What are the side effects? It's all right there instantly. I know that wasn't the answer you were expecting, but I think it's easier than going to the literature.
No, it's a fantastic answer. Uh, I think it speaks to the courage as well that you have leaned into putting this up and making it part of not only the organization you work within, the institution, but the wider world of saying, let's actually give this a shot. There's so many hurdles. I think the red tape would be one of the most painful parts. Research just wants to get up and go and still be methodical and safe and the like. But the pain point of the countless hours of bureaucracy would be, the hardest part. So, thanking you so much for your efforts and championing something that is, I think, lots of people around the world have discussed and obviously with great hope, but it's so important to get this in actual research that we can point to something with a level of trust, a level of understanding that this is rigorous. This isn't just pie in the sky. This is done really thoughtfully.
I like the fact that I began as a skeptic. In fact, I have a friend who's an influencer in this space who we go out to dinner, let's say, and he'd treat me as if I were an expert, and he'd ask me questions, and he'd ask me more questions until I really knew I didn't know what I was talking about. And so he was, in fact, the one who brought me to that conference where I saw the neuroimaging data that started the whole thing off.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Jerry. Wishing you and your colleagues, all the best with continuing to just bring data and light to this, and hopefully it continues to show positive results, because there's a large number of people who are suffering every day, and if there's anything that we can do that complements what's already available is remarkable. And I think this is one of those stones that needs to be turned over and really examined, that's been begging to be examined for decades. So thank you again, and I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Nesh. Thanks for giving the opportunity to shed some light on this, and it's a hopeful story.